Okay, here we go. So this, I should say, this talk is based on a paper that came out a little while ago in PNAS. So if there's anything that's a little unclear, then you can find it there. Okay, and I'd like to thank my collaborators in this. So Curtis, who is in the room today, he can answer any questions you have about the complicated social media analyses. Chelsea Shine and Emily Kubin really led this paper. All right, so America is divided. The theme of many of these talks in the summer series is that people have a hard time getting along. And so the question is, well, what do we do? Well, what do we do? Even Thanksgiving dinners, it's hard to have a reasonable conversation. One of my favorite papers of late was that Thanksgiving dinners ended earlier the last few years if you had Democrats and Republicans at the same table, right? Up to like half an hour early, which basically like people give up pie or at least rush through it. And so if people are giving up pie, that's a terrible state to be in America. And so something needs to be done. Even just seeing this hat, right, probably incites some feelings inside of you, right? Whether like strong patriotism or strong antipathy, right? We're a divided nation, as you know, these graphs you've seen a zillion times already show. It's worse than it's been in a long time, probably since the Civil War. And for the first time ever, as Eli is probably going to talk about when he comes next week, out-group hate is higher than in-group love. You hate the other side more than you love your own side. And so there are many causes of political polarization, of this antipathy towards folks on the other side. And the one I'll be focusing on today is perceptions of irrationality. So are we okay? There's someone in the chat. I wasn't sure if it's me or other folks. Can people hear this talk okay? Am I spotty? Yep, okay, perfect. So people think that those on the other side are irrational, right? Such as when people who don't make a lot of money vote against income distribution, right? That's irrational. People who generally vote against their own self-interest seem irrational. And people on the other side seem irrational in general, right? Like people aren't thinking, it seems like, if you're on the other side. And so the question is, well, how do we instill a sense of rationality in our opponents? How do we make the other side seem like they're a reasonable thinking person? And it's that assumption that we think can facilitate better conversations. How do we do that? Well, since the Enlightenment, and especially for us scientists, one thing that we think is important for establishing rationality is facts. Hewing to the facts, basing your opinions and your statements and your political positions upon facts. And so it may be that the way to get people to respect each other in political discourse is by emphasizing facts. And in fact, if you ask a representative sample of Americans, kind of like, well, what's it going to take for you to respect someone on the other side? People overwhelmingly say, give me the facts, give me the evidence. I don't want any editorializing. I don't want stories. I want just the facts. And once we have a kind of common ground of facts, then we can come to kind of some understanding, some respect. And so is that the case? Well, what we did is we assessed again in the abstract, pitting facts against personal experiences. So we asked people, right, imagine this person, this opponent, grounded their beliefs in facts. How much would you see them as rational? How much would you respect them? Versus how much would you respect and see them as rational if they ground their experiences or their political beliefs in personal experiences? And so, right. And so what we found here, right, is that facts scored higher than personal experience. So again, in the abstract, people really thought that emphasizing facts would increase respect. And yet, I don't know, right? Let's take this this pair of folks, right? Imagine that the woman on the right says like, well, here's some facts you didn't know, and the man on the left like, well, here's some other facts you didn't know, right? It seems hard to believe that hurling facts at each other is what's going to make this interaction, or Thanksgiving dinner, for instance, more respectful. And so rather than facts and the kind of like Enlightenment philosophers who emphasize rationality, I think we can take a page out of the book of Kierkegaard, another philosopher, but one who was more interested in the kind of power of personal experience and of faith. He was a Christian philosopher. And so one of his most famous quotes is that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. By really emphasizing that our experiences are really the bedrock of what it means to be a human and to live our lives, including our political lives, perhaps. And so it may be that the power of experience is what's useful when it comes to bridging divides and increasing respect between partisans. And this is consistent with emerging evidence in neuroscience and cognitive science about our narrative-based minds, right? It's very hard, for instance, for people to learn how to appreciate statistics, how to make sense of fractions and numbers, but almost immediately, as soon as we acquire language, we can understand stories. We can resonate with personal experiences. And so our hypothesis is that it's stories of personal experience that lead to tolerance, that lead to respect between political opponents. And in the first test of this, what we did was we looked at YouTube comments, which are not known for being, hotbeds of respect. In fact, they're known for the exact opposite, right? Lots of nasty people saying nasty things in YouTube. And so what we want to do is examine something that's especially likely to be divisive, abortion-related videos. And so these abortion-related videos each had a political slant, so either pro-life or pro-choice. But some of them were more focused on people's personal experiences, like these ones, for instance. And some were more focused on facts, on statistics about abortion, right? Whether pro-choice or pro-life. And so what we did is we compared the facts videos with the experience videos based on the kind of comments that people made. And we used Luke, which is a linguistic inquiry program to kind of analyze the tone or the sentiment of those comments, right? So were they relatively warmer, nicer, or relatively colder and meaner? And what we found is that for videos with personal experience, they were more positive in their tone than videos that emphasized facts. So we looked at hundreds of thousands of comments, and this was a powerful finding. It also was the case that personal experience videos increased the kind of social connection language that people use, like people were trying to really affiliate with the speakers of these videos. More evidence suggesting that personal experiences can be powerful when there's divisive topics. So stories of personal experience seem to lead to tolerance, but the question is, well, what kind of experience, right? There are as many experiences as there are people in the world and hours in the day. And so we suggest that the most powerful experiences for increasing tolerance are those of harm or potential harm. And so Darwin realized long ago that it's rational for any organism to want to avoid harm, right? To escape potential damage to itself or its kin, for instance. And so what we suggest is that we all implicitly understand the rationality of harm avoidance. And so experiences of harm should foster respect through perceptions of rationality. And so this is the key model of the paper. So emphasizing personal experiences versus facts. So the blue person's talking about their political views. And the red person is saying, well, personal experiences, that makes them seem more rational, and so I'm going to respect them more. Now, the other thing I want to draw your attention to is that green call out that says truth. So if you think about truth, which is probably the biggest topic that we can think about as scientists, it seems that there is one side that is truthier than the other, and that is facts, right? So you can be entitled to your own opinion, right? But you're not entitled to your own facts. Facts seem truer, don't they? Well, I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure. So even if you take kind of some incendiary tweets, the idea of fake news in the world today suggests that facts may not be as robust as perhaps they once were. And to be honest, I don't know if they ever were that robust, right, for our narrative-made minds. But at least for right now, facts are under fire, right? People have their own facts, their alternative facts. And so it may be that facts are not actually seen as truer, there's Jazz, hi Jazz, than personal experiences. And perhaps it might be the opposite, right? Stories of personal experience might lead to more tolerance because they seem somehow truer, right? They deeply resonate with ourselves, and we can see the inner truth in them. And so for the studies, we did about 15 of them. I'm not going to talk about all today, but they're in the paper and the supplemental materials if you want to dig into them. Okay. And so in the first kind of study that we did, this kind of standard study that we do in moral psychology and that it kind of repeat through this paper, is we provided a political opponent who provided facts to back up their political views or an experience. And so we did this with something like taxes, right? So I believe we should cut taxes because, right, stats say that cutting taxes increases economic output. Or you can imagine a personal experience, which is something like, because if we don't cut taxes, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my small business, right? So that's a personal experience grounded in harm. So we did the same with environmental restrictions to mining and to guns, right? Probably one of the most hot button topics today. And so what we found is that when people provided personal experiences for their political views, opponents saw them as more rational compared to facts and respected them more. And we got the predicted mediation pattern. So personal experiences lead to perceived rationality, which lead to respect. And we didn't get any difference across politics, suggesting it's not just a liberal or a conservative effect. The next thing we did was we tested this with in-person conversations. So we did this on campus and we got passersby to talk about guns with a Confederate. And the Confederate took the opposite view of the participant and grounded that opposing view in either facts or personal experiences. It's kind of a fun study to run because people don't want to be disrespectful to people in person, especially a college student. And so we really had to amp it up. So we had to get the college student to say, I don't know how anyone can be, like pro-gun rights or pro-gun control. If you think that, you're un-American, right? Like really kind of throw down the gauntlet and try to get some conflict. And then after they said that, they said the reason that I'm, let's say, pro-gun rights is because guns help people protect themselves against a number of things in a statistic, or they'll say, when I was home once, my mom used a gun to protect us from an intruder, right? A personal experience. We recorded those conversations, and then we had research assistants code the conversations. And we excluded the part that the Confederate said, so everyone was blind to condition. And what we coded was how respectful the Confederate was based on condition and how rational they seemed to treat the Confederate. And so what we found, consistent with our prediction, is that the more in the personal experience condition, the participants saw the Confederate as more rational and respected them more. And we got the same mediation analysis. Now, there's a number of potential differences between facts and personal experiences that the reviewers asked about. Here are three. So perhaps personal experiences are more concrete. They're somehow more emotionally evocative, and they're perhaps more specific. And so this is maybe part of the power of personal experiences in general, but you can still obtain these effects even when you make personal experiences and facts equal along these dimensions. And so we found the same model controlling for all these things and others as well. Now, what kind of personal experiences? As I mentioned, I think that they should be relevant to the issue at hand, right? So if you have a personal experience with, I don't know, car theft, and then you talk about taxes, right? It's maybe a compelling personal experience, but it's not relevant, right? It doesn't seem to be rationally related. So it should be relevant. We suggest it should be grounded in harm, vulnerability, and it should happen to you or a close loved one and not some random person, right? It should be personal. And so there's evidence for this. So in one study, we kind of switched the personal experiences. So you either read a personal experience about taxes and the tax condition or guns and the gun condition, or we switched it and the person provides the personal experience about guns and the tax condition and about taxes and the gun condition. It didn't work in those conditions as we predicted, so it has to be a relevant personal experience. The more it's linked to harm, we'd argue, the more powerfully it increases respect. And so we compared a kind of standard harm-based experience, a statistic, or a non-harm-based experience. So if you're pro-gun, for instance, you might say, I used a gun at a firing range and it seemed safe, and I really enjoyed it. Now the interesting thing is that again, the harm-based experience is the highest in terms of rationality and respect, but the non-harm-based experience is better than the facts, right? Showcasing the power of personal experience. So just having some experience with a gun makes you more respected than having a whole array of stats at your disposal. I don't know if that makes me a little sad, maybe, but that's just the power of personal experience. All right, and it should be personal, we'd argue, right? It should kind of happen to you rather than something that you've read about. And so when we tested this, we compared the same personal experience as it happened to you, or a sibling, or a friend, or an acquaintance, or a book character, right? That's maximally different. We found a gradient of personal experience, such that when it happened to you is the most powerful. When it happened to someone you knew directly, it was reasonably powerful. And when it happened to someone you read about, not very powerful. Okay, so again, relevant harm-based and personal experiences are most powerful at increasing respect across the divide. Now, does this effect work in the real world? Well, we already found it in the YouTube comments, but we wanted to drill down and look a little more systematically. So one thing we did was we reran the kind of like core study where we compared facts versus experiences to ground people's views. And we provided real facts about guns or people's real experiences. And we got the real facts from websites that have a bunch of gun facts, easy to find. And we got the real experiences from MTurkers. Now, these are also surprisingly easy to find, right? America is a nation fascinated with guns one way or the other. And it turns out that if you just ask people online to give us an experience about guns, people have very, very powerful experiences. And so what we did is we divided these experiences into those that were high in harm, involved some kind of moderate. So high in harm would be witnessing a murder, for instance, or defending yourself from a violent crime. Moderate harm would be, right, witnessing someone being, shot but not killed. And then low harm would be some kind of personal experience where maybe, you were close to being harmed or something like that. And facts. And so when we compare them, what we find is personal experiences win out from facts every time. But the high harm experiences are the most likely to increase respect, again, mediated through rationality. We also looked at news transcripts from Fox and CNN interviews. And so to do this, we got the transcripts from folks like was it Bill O'Reilly and other anchors on CNN and Fox News, and we coded them for how let's say Bill O'Reilly treated his guest as being rational, how respectful he was to the guest. And so what we found is that when guests emphasize personal experiences, hosts treated them as more rational, and that mediated the effect of personal experiences on increased respect. So rationality leads to respect, even in kind of controversial scenarios like Bill O'Reilly grilling someone, or a CNN anchor, giving someone, I wouldn't say an interrogation, but a heated interview between interlocutors. So again and again, we find this association, this mediation analysis. But what about truth? We've looked at the model a lot of times, but I think the truth is one of the most interesting things about this model. And so it's important to emphasize that this is perceived truth, right? We can't actually examine like what is the truthiness of something, but it's the perceived truthiness. And we compared in this study moral scenarios, so opinions about guns, let's say, versus non-moral things like opinions about blenders. And we also looked at agreement and disagreement, okay? So we've got a complicated 2x2x2 cell design, which I tell students never to do, but sometimes you just have to, okay? So you're talking to someone about either guns or blenders. They either agree with you or don't agree with you, and they either give you a fact or an experience. So a fact about a blender might be like it's got the best horsepower in its class, the Ninja or the Vitamix. For guns, things that we've been talking about, like whether guns save lives in general or whether guns take lives in general. And a personal experience about a blender would be just like, I love the roar of the motor or tasting those smoothies when I use the blender to make breakfast in the morning. All right, so here's what the graph's going to look like. We've got non-moral and moral. We've got facts and experiences, and we've got people who agree and disagree. And you can see one bar is kind of hatched out, and that is the moral, facts, disagree, right? So moral disagree is what we've been looking at this entire time. And what we wanted to see is whether this bar is relatively lower than all other bars. And it's really that facts in the moral domain, when you disagree with someone, are seen as less true. And that's the DV here on the y-axis, perceived truth. So what have we found? What do we find? We find what we thought we would find. So there's a variety of kind of like main effects and interactions, but the key finding is that moral facts and disagreements are seen as less true. And it's a big difference between that and personal experiences. All right, well, of course, we doubt moral facts, right? But one could argue that we also doubt some people's personal experiences. And so some of the driving forces of social movements like Black Lives Matter, and here's Tarana Burke, founder of Me Too, right? Part of this movement was really about how people doubt the experiences of folks who may not have as much power in society. So women of color frequently report, right, that their experiences are devalued or doubted more than others. And so one question was whether this effect would generalize to more diverse targets. And so would we find the same effect if we had the person who's giving the facts or giving the experiences be a Black woman, for instance? And so I should say, in general, right, Stephen Roberts has this paper out in Perspectives. It's a pretty amazing paper, and he's really calling for us to make our science more diverse. And so this study was kind of heeding his call as well. Okay, so we had our standard study where someone provides a fact or an experience about why they are pro or anti-gun. And the person providing this fact or experience is a Black woman. And we found the same effects. The same effects replicate as we would predict. So it's nice that it generalizes to diversity, to diverse context for the science. And it's also nice that it diversifies for the effect in general, right? And so I think this really highlights, I think, the power of some of these social movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, right? Because they're really social movements, not of facts, but personal experiences, right? So you go on Twitter, say Black in the Ivory, and you just see like the sheer volume of personal experiences of people's stories about their experiences being a woman or being Black. Now, one question I often get is like, well, does this blur the line between facts and experiences, right? So seeing thousands of tweets about people's personal experiences, they almost become statistics at that point. And I think it's a really interesting point. And I think that, facts and experiences aren't natural kinds in some ways, that there's more of a gradient. But I think future research should look more at really what does it mean to be a fact or an experience, or what does it mean to be true if you want to get to the biggest question of all. Okay. So across 15 studies, we found support for this association, that personal experiences are seen as more rational, which lead to increased respect, and that's because they seem truer. So political divisions are as strong as they've ever been, and it's important to try to kind of bridge these, both through science and through our own interactions with people. And as we do so, it's important to remember that facts are not the same as truth. And in fact, at least in our minds, personal experiences seem much truer than facts. What kind of personal experiences? Well, those about harm or potential harm. And so if you're having a conversation with someone, it's good to bear this in mind, right? Facts do matter, of course. We're scientists, we're committed to finding the facts that exist in the world, but perhaps the best way to open a conversation with a political opponent isn't to kind of hurl facts and statistics at them. It's perhaps better to highlight your own personal experiences, especially those of harm. That is all I've got. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. got about half an hour. I actually have some more data after this about some new stuff that that Curtis is doing, but I can take some questions now, and then we can go through the rest of the data if there's interest. And sorry if I talked fast. All right, Tristan.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I read this article, and so I'm glad that I got to hear it straight from you. But I was interested in how you defined like how someone was an opponent or not. Did you make their political identity salient, or was it simply that they disagreed on that particular issue? Because I feel like they could have different effects. If their political identity is made like super salient, they might doubt their experiences even more, rather than if it's just they disagree on that particular issue and their identity is more ambiguous.
That's a great point. And most of our studies did prime political identity because we wanted to know how to assign people to an opponent. So we asked them about, liberal, conservative in general, or maybe, I think it was liberal, conservative, or maybe even worse, right, Democrat, Republican, in terms of like priming salient in groups. And then we presented people with facts versus experience. So I think you're probably right, it probably amplified it. I think there are probably lots of cases where you do know people's identity, right? So you do see someone with the red hat, or like, a Kamala Harris pin or whatever. So I think it applies mostly to the cases where these things are strongest, and in some sense, I think that's almost the most important cases. But it would be interesting to look beyond these cases to whether it works for kind of like, two friends just kind of talking. Although the YouTube things, right, the more naturalistic analyses suggest that it works even if you don't prime people with their identity. Although again, it's pretty obvious what it is.
Yeah, I think there's definitely cases where there's like both. Also, I had one more question about your thoughts on how target characteristics like race or gender might differentially impact the results in different domains. So you looked at guns and Black women, but you were trying to generalize it to like the Me Too movement. And I think it might be a little bit different because Black women are often seen as more like agentic and less, having less, feelings or whatever. And so I feel like in the gun example, it might not have an effect, but in something like Me Too, it might actually. I was just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't have data to speak to this. The story from the review process is we tried to run a study that looked at something that was more topical. So we looked at Black Lives Matter because we wanted to like actually look at it in the context where people are talking about it today. The problem with that is it is really hard to come up with a plausible experimental manipulation where a Black person is like really against Black Lives Matter, right? The editor basically argued that the manipulation was terrible because like you can't independently manipulate that believably. And so I think you're certainly right that these intersect with particular issues in ways that I don't know, but I think it's hard to manipulate it experimentally, and that's why we didn't look at it in the study. But it's definitely a fair point.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so there's some questions in the chat. It's hard for me to read and talk, but here we go. Tim, do you want to just say these things?
Sure. So 2 quick questions. So the first one is, how do you think about setting up a fair test between facts and experiences? In other words, how do you ensure that you are not comparing like weak facts against, or not so compelling facts against more compelling experiences? Or is it even something like you need to sort of just put that point aside because they're sort of not comparable things and just test a range of facts against a range of experiences? That's sort of the first broad question. And then the second one is just simply, do you notice any reliable trends about who is more or less receptive to facts relative to experiences?
So to the first question, we did control for ratings of kind of evocativeness, compellingness, those things of facts. So the kind of obvious perceptions of those things. And this was rated by participants, right? So participants said that these facts were indeed compelling, but that still wasn't enough to get them to see their conversational partner as rational and respect them. There might be other ways, right? I mean, I guess there's two broad concerns, right? Like maybe facts and experiences are apples and oranges, and so you can't compare them, and so it seems strange to compare them. But then people make the opposite claim, which is like, well, it's just a continuum, and isn't a fact just an amalgamation of personal experiences, and isn't a personal experience like a single fact, and so aren't they the same? So I think, you know, like they're very the same and they're totally different. Could both be levied against this work, and so maybe somewhere in the middle is a reasonable stance. And then in terms of the reliable trends about receptivity, the answer is, I don't know. We didn't look for it. We didn't notice kind of general political differences, which is what we were most concerned about. I don't think we found any gender differences.
Education?
Education, I don't know. I'm sure we looked. The supplemental materials is, you know, like 100 pages long.
Yeah.
But that's a good point. I mean, this is like very unscientific, right? From my personal experience, you know, like on Twitter, it seems like even educated professors are willing to, you know, discount the other side's facts, but they're seemingly less.
I totally agree. I would totally bet, you know, having not seen anything, that education is actually probably a pretty weak predictor of it. I bet plenty of highly educated people still are more receptive to experiences than facts.
Maybe the fact is even stronger for them, right? Because you're like, I know the facts, I make the facts. You're like, you know, the Judge Dredd of facts. And so
yeah, also better at contextualizing and arguing away facts that are inconvenient to you.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so it's interesting, right? There's some work suggesting that, you know, creativity is linked to maybe more cheating, because you like have an intelligence a little bit too, because you can kind of like work your way around the ethical constraints. So it may be that the same is true for discounting facts.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Arathi says, is there some indication about how perceived humor or satire might play a mediating role? Could you say a little more if it's possible? Like funny personal experiences, or I could just riff about the power of humor. I can riff. All right, what do I think about humor and satire? So personal experiences. I mean, yeah, actually, I'm not quite sure. Like, could you be sarcastic about facts? Or Trisha, are you going to save me?
No, sorry, I have a different question.
I can help out.
Okay,
often humor has an effect of like changing the level of identification we have for a particular topic. And so that might be a circumstance in which a person's more receptive to like thinking about a thing in a new way or having new insights. And so if the personal experience is particularly humorous, that might get people in this sort of cognitive mode where they're willing to think about issues differently than normal.
It's a better answer than I was going to give, that's for sure, as you could already tell. Thanks, Jake, for answering that question. Direct all questions to Jake from now on. All right, Trisha.
So my question was that, sure, hearing people's personal experience might help someone respect the other person more, but do you think it really changes anyone's mind? They might think, for example, if somebody is an anti-vaxxer and they had a kid who died from side effects of measles because of the measles vaccine, so it makes sense they would be anti-vaxxer, but does that necessarily change people's mind about vaccination itself? So does it really change how we think about those facts or those ideas? Or does it just make us more receptive to that person?
Right. So the difference between, you know, there's like respect, receptivity. You're kind of like processing these things deeply, and then there's ultimately attitude change. And we, as you point out, really only did the respect part, and explicitly in the paper said we're not looking at attitude change, in some sense, because I don't know if that goal is even possible in kind of America today. But I think respect is an important precondition, at least, for attitude change. And certainly we need to respect people before we can engage with their ideas in a deep level. I mean, there's also a broader disagreement of whether we want to change people's mind. So I'm involved in this initiative called the New Pluralists, which is a bunch of practitioners and academics trying to create a more pluralistic society. And some folks in there really advocate for this idea that, like, you shouldn't want to change people's minds, right? You should, like, we want this diversity of opinions. I mean, I don't know if I want anti-vaxxers, right? I don't know if I want, like, explicitly anti-scientific beliefs out there, but it's certainly the case that you need different perspectives in a society to achieve the kind of, like, best outcomes. That's maybe my dodge of saying that the effect is not weakened or is not strong enough to change people's minds. But I think there are cases where really powerful personal experiences can change people's minds, but we didn't look at them here. That's a good point.
Can I fit in one more question?
Sure, yeah.
All right. So the other question was, do you think it would be different of whether personal experience versus facts change, like, make people respect the other person more? If it's something more like a threat which is more realistic and, like, it's really going to happen soon, like, for example, COVID, versus something which is more abstract and its cause and effect is not very clear. Do you think people will respect facts more when it's something more realistic and urgent?
Interesting. So we have some work spearheaded by Frank Katchanoff, who might be in the Zoom room, about different reactions to realistic threats. So literal loss of life or economic threat, or symbolic threats, right? It's like will destroy the foundations of American liberty in a kind of vague sense, right? Or our traditions or whatever. And so when people ignore the realistic threats you're concerned about, you kind of dehumanize them, right? It's really aversive. But when they ignore symbolic threats, it's less aversive, right? So if someone's like, forget those dying kids, it doesn't matter, then you think that's outrageous. But if they say, like, well, forget the kind of moral fabric of America, whatever that means, then you're a little less upset about it. That being said, I don't know if facts or experience would intersect with that in an interesting way, but I think we should probably do those studies. It's a great idea. Yeah. All right, we have a little more time. I can talk about some new data that we have, unless there is. Okay. All right, we'll do Farouk and then I'll go into new data. Farouk says, what do you think about personal experience versus reported personal experiences? Reported being someone else reports them, or?
Yes. Yeah. Because oftentimes, in politics or in, let's say, friend groups, we don't always talk about what we have experienced personally, but we oftentimes talk about what other people experience. We talk about that in the news,
right,
etc.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So we do have the kind of gradient study, which is that the experiences that happen to yourself are are more respect-inducing than something you just kind of read about. But there's also, power in putting together a compelling narrative. So you can imagine a reporter, for instance, who talks to someone and relays that experience. It's kind of halfway between, right? Like you're seeing that person's experience, but it's woven into something perhaps more powerful than it would be if they just told you about it. So I think the reported, and if it's coming from a reporter, that could be powerful. At the same time, you could discount it if it's being reported by someone who you don't trust, right? Like if you're liberal Fox News, if you're conservative MSNBC. A good question. Okay, so in the next little bit, we'll talk about a little more data. All right, so look, personal experiences induce more respect than facts, but you at least have to be willing to talk to someone on the other side first. And you might not be willing to talk to someone because you might think that they are pure evil, right? So here's a picture of Satan. And maybe you're thinking like, that's too extreme. Like, I don't think people on the other side are Satan. I don't think they're pure evil. But I don't know. Maybe people do think those on the other side are too evil. Maybe this caricature of the other side as, actually being Satan is perhaps not too extreme. And so what we hypothesized, and this is work led by Curtis Puryear, he's a postdoc in the center, is that people have a basic immorality bias. And that's that they think that the other side, lacks basic moral qualities. And so in this paper, what we did is we asked people about their own morality and those of that of the other side. And we included, so this is often done, sometimes it's asked like in the abstract, like how moral is the other side, or about these kind of like ambiguous things, right? Ambiguous moral questions, like a trolley problem, right? What do you think the other side would do, perhaps? This was really basic, right? Like, what do you think the other side thinks about animal abuse or child pornography? So if you're conservative, like, what do you think liberals think about child pornography, right? Are they generally for it or generally against it? And we did a bunch of studies, and in one we incentivized for accuracy. So like, give me the percentage of people in the other side who think that child pornography is acceptable, or animal abuse, embezzlement, whatever, right? All right, we incentivize for accuracy. We're doing this again for some reason. Here we go. And here is what we get. So this is a little bit of a busy graph, but what you can find is that the kind of middle bars, the light blue and the orange bars, that's the kind of the other side estimate, right? That's the outgroup perceptions. And so what you find is that outgroup perceptions are much higher than in-group perceptions. So you think that, so Republicans think that the average, like 30% of Democrats are okay with cheating on their spouse, right? And it's a little lower for Republicans, but still pretty high. The average Democrat thinks that almost 35% of Republicans are down with tax fraud. Right? That's really high, right? That's like over a third of Republicans, right, are cheating in their taxes, or at least would be down with it. And you find much smaller effects for things like animal abuse and child pornography. Again, I think because those are like clearly harmful and the core of morality. But it's still pretty high, right? So the average Republican thinks that 15% of Democrats think that child pornography is acceptable. Like that's crazy, right? That's like I don't know actually what a value that 15% of people in America think is true, but like I don't know, like electronic dance music, right? Maybe that's about 15%, right? Like that's a lot of people in America. 15% is something like I don't know, 45 million people. That's a lot of people who are down with child pornography. And so what this suggests, right? This like deep mistrust. And I should say that the real answer is like nobody. Basically, nobody thinks that any of these things are acceptable because they're basic morality. And so it suggests a simple intervention for making polarization less severe is just telling someone that, look, this person on the other side who you're going to be interacting with, they think that child pornography is wrong. Now, the funny thing about that statement is it's actually, in a kind of Bayesian sense, totally non-diagnostic, because 100% of people in America basically think that child pornography and animal abuse is wrong. But so right? So if something is totally undiagnostic and uninformative, then it shouldn't have any effect. But actually, we're thinking it's going to have a big effect because people have this bias, this basic immorality bias. And so what we did is we paired people in this study. You say you're going to be talking to someone. In this example, it's Tyler K. And it turns out that you and Tyler K agree that all these issues, tax fraud, watching child pornography, embezzlement, animal abuse, homicide, and cheating on a spouse, you think they're immoral, and they think that they are immoral too. And so what we find is that when you correct this bias, people are less likely to dehumanize the opponent, and equally likely to want to be on a team with a cross-partisan who's basically immoral as someone on your own political team, right? So if you're a Democrat, you're happy to be on a team with a Republican who has basic morality as you are to be on a team with another Democrat. So basically erases this kind of like in-group bias. All right, and there's also some effects on behavior in that you're more likely to want to engage with someone on the other side. So you're going to sign up to receive information from a bipartisan group, and you're going to be more likely to stay with a teammate. Okay, so suggesting that one way to bridge divides is to just inform people that the other side is not super evil. They're not the devil. And that's enough to kind of nudge some more positive interactions. All right, I'll end on Satan there and take some questions. So Sarah asks, do I think immorality bias can be a function of the mechanism of dehumanization? Yeah, it's a good question, right? I'm not sure what to think now that we've had these conversations about dehumanization these last two meetings, but I still believe in dehumanization. And I think that being a moral person is wrapped up with being a human person. And I think that that's why we show that increasing morality decreases dehumanization, right? They're all kind of like intermixed. And so I think that dehumanization is a pretty powerful driver. And I know work of Noor Kateli and some other folks like blatant dehumanization, I think is also tied to morality or perceptions of immorality. All right, I'll do Mariel's question and then you can hop in, Jake. All right, does it have to be all or nothing to debias person? For example, how would someone react if they were told person A agrees that people should be able to use guns, not just high power rifles? Right, so I think this is probably what happens more in the real world, where you learn something about another person that's like more ambiguous, right? So like, I think I should have a rifle for hunting. I'm not sure about high capacity magazines or semi-automatic guns. And so you're learning these kind of like pieces about someone, pieces that you can understand in one light as being moral, but maybe in another light as not being moral. Like, what do you use them to hunt with, right? Maybe you hunt the most deadly game of all, man, I don't know, right? And so I think the power of this effect is that people make such blatantly wrong assumptions about the morality of the other side, and that we can target that despite it being totally uninformative in a sense, is something that's interesting. Good question though. Jake?
Hey, my question is more about the first part of the talk, but maybe your response will sort of bridge the two. I'm sort of curious about like if there's times in which perceived rationality could backfire. And so what I was particularly thinking about during the first part of the talk was like, during the Bush administration, George Bush was sort of seen as this like aloof goofball who like didn't know much and wasn't really in control of things. And Dick Cheney was perceived as being like the rational actor behind the scenes who was sort of responsible for all the behavior of the administrations. And so like George Bush was seen as a goofball, but Dick Cheney is really seen as the evil one. And people might have respected Cheney more as well, but he's also like condemned more by the people who disagreed with him. And so I'm just wondering if like the perceived rationality could also enhance perceptions of evil of the opponent under some conditions.
Yeah, I think that is true. After he published his paper Igor Grossman DM'd me and said, look, is this really rationality or is it kind of like a reasonableness, right? Like some kind of wisdom or appreciation for the situation. And so you could have rationality be like a cold, cynical actor, or you could be someone who's just kind of reasonable, right? Making the kind of judgments that you'd expect if someone had that personal experience. And so I think you could imagine that these might come apart. And I think that's particularly the case when it comes to personal experiences, because personal experiences of harm, right, those would in some sense make you a moral patient, and that seems antithetical to the kind of like cold, calculated agency, right? And so I think the more you have personal experience related to harm, perhaps the more you're seen as being reasonable. but not perhaps to the kind of like cold, uber rational that Cheney was seen to be. But good question. All right, Ramal asks, is thinking of someone else as the devil? I don't know what the picture is of a goat with, of a man with goat horns. So it's definitely an animalistic dehumanization. And with this kind of daily political polarization, considering the other side, the devil be considered everyday dehumanization or a special case of dehumanization. I feel like we need Julian Schroeder here to get into varieties of dehumanization here. I think generally, seeing someone as truly evil is more consistent with mechanistic dehumanization, right? Because they're an agent. So at least, in kind of my theory of morality, there's like agents and patients, and agents can be good or evil. So it's certainly the case that someone who's truly evil is high in agency. And animalistic and mechanistic dehumanization is like kind of correlated with that, but a little different. But at least in narrative accounts, so the Japanese in the Second World War were seen as being very evil, and also were generally mechanistically, the Nazis as well were mechanistically, they were seen as robots basically, right? Like cold robots who were just like perpetrating evil. On the other hand, narratives of, let's say, slaves were that they were more like animals and livestock, and they could be evil, but they would lack the kind of full appreciation for morality that that a group dehumanized like the Nazis might have. So I think that's the kind of distinction. It's a good question. All right, so I'll ask Arathi and then Will. Was morality on the other side studied? Yeah. So so the question was, it was an all or nothing, like whether the other side thinks it's acceptable or not, or is there a continuum? And yes, it was just binary. So we wanted to make it easy as possible and really force people to say, like, look, the other side thinks that animal abuse is acceptable or not, right? So we wanted to make this extreme just to reveal how biased people were. But I would imagine it would work as a Likert scale as well, but the effects would probably be a little less powerful. Will?
Yeah, did y'all measure affective polarization as like being a predictor of those like erroneous moral assumptions? So like affective polarization in individual participants?
I don't know. Curtis, are you here? Curtis? Maybe we'll never know.
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry.
No, I don't think we looked at any indicators of affective polarization beforehand to predict it. I'm trying to think if we had any other predictors beforehand. I think we mostly looked at outcomes though.
Yeah. Another cool thing that you could do is like measure it beforehand and then just tell people the actual numbers of the other side. Kind of like Lees and Sakara's recent intervention on meta-perceptions, and then just see if affective polarization decreases after letting people know those facts. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a good thought. Yeah, I think the more debiasing we can have out there, the better. Agreed. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes left. We can just break a little early so folks who are taking the summer seminar can have a quick moment to get a drink and refresh their mind, including me. I'm going to check to see if I have internet now, and then I'll be back in a few minutes to talk to the students about giving talks and making figures. And for folks who aren't students, thanks very much for coming. We'll have another talk next week, and I hope everyone's having a safe and fun summer. So thanks so much for such great questions, and we will see you soon.